Okay, so forget everything you think you know about medieval warfare from the movies. It really wasn't just about knights in shining armor and chivalry. The real story? It was a brutal, centuries-long arms race. We're going to deconstruct this whole thing, how the knight, the castle, and eventually the cannon battled it out for supremacy and completely rewrote the rules of the battlefield in the process.
Right, those romantic stories of chivalry, they kind of miss the main point. The true story of medieval warfare is all about constant, ruthless evolution. You've got this relentless cycle of new weapons, which leads to new defenses, which then inspires new strategies. Every single innovation was basically born out of a desperate need to survive the last one.
So our story really kicks off with the undisputed king of the battlefield, the heavily armored mounted knight. For centuries, this wasn't just another soldier. Oh no, this was the ultimate weapon system of its day. A terrifying fusion of armor, a powerful warhorse, and sheer force that just seemed invincible.
See, a knight wasn't just a warrior. He was an economic and social powerhouse. A full suit of plate armor, that could cost as much as a small farm. The specially bred warhorse, that alone could be worth the entire annual income of a village. This insane expense meant that warfare was pretty much an aristocratic game, creating this exclusive elite class of warriors that stood at the very core of any feudal army, miles apart from everyone else on the field.
So, who was everyone else? Well, for the most part, it was the feudal levy. When a lord decided to go to war, his vassals were required to show up with their own infantry. And as you can probably guess, the quality of these conscripted tropes was, let's just say inconsistent is putting it mildly. The gap between them was just enormous. On one hand, you have the professional, heavily invested knights, and on the other, you have the infantry. They were often so poorly equipped and trained that sources from the time just dismissed them as little more than rabble. On an actual battlefield, the difference in what they could do was absolutely staggering.
The knights' dominance on the open field was so total that it actually forced the first great countermeasure. And interestingly, it wasn't a new weapon. It was a whole new environment, the stone castle.
Think about it. On an open battlefield, a charge of heavy cavalry was pretty much unstoppable. It was the nuclear option of its time. And that right there was the strategic genius of the castle. It completely neutralized the knight's #1 advantage. It was like a giant stone declaration that just said, nope, I'm not playing your game. You simply can't charge a 30-foot wall on a horse. This quote from Count Baldwin just nails it. An enemy army could come through, burn your fields, terrorize your peasants, but as long as you held the castle, you couldn't be removed. Your power was literally anchored in stone. Now, attacking a castle? That was a massive undertaking. This wasn't a quick battle. It was a long, drawn-out engineering project. First, you had to isolate it, cut off all supplies. Then you'd spend weeks, sometimes months, just bombarding it with catapults or trying to dig tunnels underneath to make the walls collapse. And only after all that could you even begin to think about a direct assault. It was just a slow, expensive, and incredibly brutal process. But, of course, the arms race didn't stop there. While castles were solving the defensive problem, a whole new evolution was happening back out on the open field. That so-called rabble, well, they were starting to get organized. And you have to talk about the Swiss. They basically perfected an ancient idea. A dense block of men carrying incredibly long spears, or pikes. These pike formations were like moving walls of steel points. A charging horse would literally impale itself long before its rider could even get close enough to strike a blow. For the first time in centuries, disciplined infantry could consistently beat elite heavy cavalry on an open field. It was a game changer.
And at the very same time, missile weapons were changing everything. Now, the crossbow was powerful and pretty easy to learn, but it was painfully slow to reload. The English longbow, though, that was a true force multiplier. Sure, it took years of constant practice to master, but a kingdom that could field thousands of these guys could create a killing zone that no knight on earth could survive crossing.
12 arrows a minute. Just stop and picture that. Now imagine a line of 1,000 longbowmen. That is 12,000 armor-piercing arrows flying downrange every 60 seconds. That's not a battle. It's a storm of steel. It was a complete paradigm shift. And yet all of these incredible developments, the disciplined pikemen, the highly skilled archers, they would all soon be totally overshadowed by the single greatest military revolution of the entire era: gunpowder. what is just astonishing is how quickly this all happened. I mean, we go from the very first known European drawing of a gun in 1326 to cannons being a common sight on the battlefield less than 25 years later. By the late 1400s, armies had mobile artillery trains that could march with the troops and batter down walls in a matter of days, not months.
And you don't have to take my word for it. As the scholar Petrarch noted all the way back in 1350, this wasn't some rare, exotic technology that nobody had. It was rapidly integrated into the art of war, becoming a standard tool that would, well, change everything. And that's really the bottom line. Gunpowder was the great equalizer. It didn't matter how thick your castle walls were. Cannons could just blast them to rubble. It didn't matter how finely crafted your plate armor was. A single lead ball could punch right through it. In one fell swoop, the two pillars of medieval warfare, the knight and the castle, were made obsolete.
But technology was never the whole story. Winning wars has always been about more than just having the best gear. It was also about strategy, about supply, and about thinking way beyond the next big battle.
In fact, commanders literally had a guidebook for it. The ancient Roman text De Re Militari was, according to historians, basically the Bible of warfare throughout the Middle Ages. And its core lesson, if you want peace, prepare for war, completely shaped how medieval leaders thought about conflict, pushing them to emphasize planning and strategy over just simple brute force.
This way of thinking led to some brutal but very effective tactics like the chevauchée. See, this wasn't about fighting the enemy army head-on. It was about destroying the enemy's economy and their will to fight. You'd ride through their lands, burning crops, burning villages, making it totally impossible for them to feed their soldiers. It was total war, medieval style.
And this points to a fundamental truth of warfare back then. Logistics were everything. Without modern supply trains, armies had to live off the land. This meant things like foraging and looting weren't just bad behavior by rogue soldiers. They were often official, necessary policy just to keep the war machine running. And that harsh reality dictated where and when armies could even operate.
So when you look back, the story of medieval warfare is really one of constant disruption, where the ultimate weapon of one generation becomes the next generation's relic. Gunpowder made the knight obsolete. And it leaves us with a pretty critical question for our own time. What technology emerging right now is on the verge of doing the exact same thing to the modern soldier?